The bar went completely silent when a 90-pound Belgian Malinois snapped his lead and charged. People dove sideways, chairs scraped concrete. Someone screamed near the jukebox and knocked a pitcher of beer off the table, trying to get away from the animal coming across the floor. The dog wasn't barking. That was the part that made it worse. He was completely silent, moving with the focused, locked-in acceleration of an animal that had been trained to close distance fast, and he was aimed directly at a woman in blue scrubs sitting alone at the far end of the bar. She didn't run. She didn't flinch. She set down her Coke, turned on the bar stool, and looked the dog square in the eyes as 90 pounds of Belgian Malinois closed the last 10 feet between them, and she said one word barely above a whisper in a language nobody in that bar recognized. The dog locked up mid-stride, dropped into a perfect prone, and pressed his chin against her boot. Every special operations soldier in that bar stopped breathing. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notifications, because stories like this one drop every single week, and you do not want to miss what happens next. Smash the like button if you're already locked in, and drop a comment below telling me what city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The town of Creston Falls, Montana sat in a wide river valley between two pine ridges, population just under 20,000, the kind of place where winters were long and people knew each other's trucks better than their faces. The emergency room at Harlow Valley Medical Center handled farm injuries, car accidents on the mountain passes, and the occasional cardiac event. Not much else. The nearest military installation was Fort Dillon, 60 miles east over switchback roads, and soldiers generally stayed on that side of the mountains, which made it unusual when 3 black SUVs rolled into the Brennan's Tap parking lot on a Thursday evening in late October, and 12 men in civilian clothes took up the large corner booth near the back wall. They didn't look like ranch hands. They didn't look like the mining crews that came through in summer. They ordered beer and kept their voices low and watched the room the way people watch rooms when they've spent years in places where watching rooms is the difference between walking out and not. Nobody gave them much trouble. Creston Falls was a town that minded its own business. The woman at the far end of the bar wasn't paying them any attention at all. Her name was Nora Callahan, 32 years old, brown hair in a knot at the back of her neck, the kind of hairstyle that had nothing to do with preference and everything to do with practicality. She had the particular tiredness of someone who had been on her feet for 10 hours and was going to be on her feet for 10 more, not the loose exhaustion of someone who needed sleep, but the compressed, stored-away tiredness of someone who had learned to carry it without letting it show. She wore dark blue scrubs with a Harlow Valley Medical Center badge clipped to her chest pocket. The badge said RN, Emergency Department. She was drinking a Coke with ice. She had a shift starting at 11, and she'd learned years ago, in conditions that had nothing to do with nursing in Montana, not to show up anywhere she needed her full reflexes with anything in her system that would slow them down. In front of her was a half-eaten plate of fries and her phone, on which she was reading something that looked like hospital documentation. The bartender, a broad, quiet man named Howie, had refilled her Coke twice without asking. She tipped well and didn't want conversation. That arrangement had suited both of them for 4 years. She didn't look up when the door opened. The dog came in on a 6-foot tactical lead, attached to a handler in a gray Henley, who cleared the entry. The way soldiers clear entries: fast scan left, fast scan right, locate the group, locate the exits, move. The dog moved with him in perfect sync, short fawn and black fur, ears rotating independently, nose pulling at the air in quick, deliberate drafts. Belgian Malinois, military working dog. Nora clocked it in about 2 seconds without lifting her eyes from her phone and went back to the documentation. The handler's name was Sergeant First Class Damon Reyes. He was guiding the dog toward the corner booth, toward the 12 men who had deployed with that dog for 2 years, and everything was proceeding normally until it wasn't. Atlas stopped. He stopped mid-stride, lead pulling taut, and turned his head toward the far end of the bar. His ears shot forward. His body went rigid in the particular way that trained working dogs go rigid when something in the environment has triggered a recognition so deep it overrides every conditioned behavior on top of it. His nostrils pulled hard and fast. Atlas, fuss. Reyes used the German heel command, standard for military working dogs. The dog didn't move. Atlas, The lead went. Not because Reyes wasn't strong enough, he was. But the dog moved with the kind of sudden, total commitment that catches even experienced handlers off guard, a shift of weight and direction so fast that the loop was through Reyes's fingers before his grip registered the change. 90 pounds of Belgian Malinois crossed Brennan's tap in 3 seconds, and everyone in his path scattered. A bar stool went over. A glass hit the floor and shattered. A woman near the jukebox pressed herself against the wall with both hands over her face and made a sound that was mostly just air. Nora looked up. She saw the dog coming. She saw his body language, the ears, the tail, the way his head was slightly lowered and his eyes were locked. And she read it the way you read it when you've spent enough time around working dogs to know the difference between a dog coming at you and a dog coming to you. She set her phone face down on the bar. She turned fully on the bar stool, put both feet on the floor, and let him come. When Atlas was 2 feet away, she said the word. One syllable, low, precise, clipped at the end with the exact cadence of someone who had said it 10,000 times in conditions where saying it right was not optional. Platz. He dropped. Full prone, chin on the floor, front paws flat, haunches down, with the clean total obedience of a dog whose conditioning ran so deep that the voice had bypassed everything else in his nervous system. He put his nose against her boot. His tail moved once, then twice, then went still. The bar was quiet enough that Nora could hear the ice shifting in her glass. She reached down without making a production of it and placed 2 fingers against the side of Atlas's neck. Not petting, not the greeting you'd give a stranger's dog, but a specific contact in a specific location that meant something between them that had nothing to do with this bar or this town. The dog made a low sound from somewhere in his chest and pressed harder against her boot. Damon Reyes crossed the bar in 6 fast steps. "Ma'am." He kept his voice careful. "I'm sorry. He has never done that. He's fully trained. He's not a threat. He's fine," Nora said. She wasn't looking at Reyes. She was looking at the dog. "How long has he been out of operational rotation?" Reyes paused. It was the pause of someone recalibrating. "I'm sorry?" "He's favoring his left rear. Not dramatically, but it's there. You can see it in how he compensated on the final approach. Old injury or a new one?" Reyes stared at her for a moment that went a beat too long. "Left hip," he said. "Shrapnel fragment. About 8 months ago. He's been cleared for... He stiffens when he's been in a vehicle for more than 2 hours. You can see it in the hip drop when he settled." Nora straightened up. "There's a 24-hour veterinary clinic on Route 9, about 4 miles out. Dr. Paulson. She has experience with military working dogs specifically. He should get the hip worked before you put him back in the vehicle tonight." She picked up her Coke and went back to her phone. Reyes stood there. He looked down at Atlas, who had not moved from Nora's boot and showed no intention of doing so. He looked back at this woman in scrubs who had just diagnosed his dog's orthopedic issue, given him a veterinary referral, and returned to reading hospital documentation, all inside of 45 seconds. He walked back to the corner booth. The man who had been watching from the moment Atlas broke was named Jake Sutter. He was tall and wide through the shoulders, with pale eyes and a face that was built for giving away nothing, which it was mostly doing right now, except for something that had settled in around his eyes while he'd been watching Nora Callahan handle a military working dog with the quiet authority of someone who didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He had seen Atlas do that once before. Once. At a forward operating base he was not authorized to name. During a night that had started badly and gotten significantly worse, there had been a combat medic moving through a casualty collection point in the dark with a headlamp and a kit that was past its resupply date. She had worked without stopping for 17 hours. She hadn't raised her voice once. Atlas had broken from his handler then too, in the middle of an active situation, which should have been impossible, and gone to her like he was returning to something he recognized. Sutter had thought about that medic occasionally over the years, the way you think about people who showed you something you hadn't known was possible. He looked at the woman at the end of the bar. Brown hair, blue scrubs, Coke with ice. Reading documentation on a Thursday night instead of drinking, he pulled out his phone and sent one text. Find out who the nurse is. Harlow Valley Medical Center had been serving Creston Falls and the surrounding county for 31 years. Medium-sized regional facility, trauma-capable, cardiac unit, 2 surgical suites, an ER that ran on rotating attendings, and a nursing staff that was perpetually understaffed and had long since stopped expecting that to change. The building was functional and not much more. The kind of hospital that knew it wasn't a teaching center or a research institution and had made its peace with being the place people came when they were hurt and afraid and had nowhere else to go for 60 miles in any direction. Nora had worked there for 4 years. She was good at her job in the way that doesn't get you noticed or praised, because the people who would notice it are too busy to stop and acknowledge it. She was good in the way that meant the department ran cleaner and faster on her shifts, that attendings ordered fewer redundant tests because she had already flagged what they needed, that the charge nurse, a veteran named Petra Wolf, who had been running that ER for 11 years and had no patience for people who couldn't do the work, quietly arranged assignments to put the most complex patients on Nora's load. Not because Petra asked Nora if she wanted them, because Nora handled them better than anyone else, and Petra was pragmatic enough to use what worked. Nobody had ever asked Nora why she was as good as she was. People in ERs are busy. You get good nurses and you get less good nurses, and you use the good ones where they're needed, and you don't generally stop to conduct an investigation into their background. Nora had a nursing degree and 4 years of clean performance reviews and a reputation among the staff for being quiet, reliable, and somewhat difficult to have a personal conversation with, and that was the full extent of what Harlow Valley Medical Center knew about her. The newest attending physician, Dr. Curtis Bragg, had arrived 8 months ago from a mid-sized hospital in Denver with strong academic credentials and the particular self-assurance of someone whose credentials had never been seriously questioned. He had decided within his first 2 weeks that Nora Callahan was one of those nurses, the kind who thought they understood medicine better than the physicians responsible for patient care, the kind who needed to be managed carefully before the dynamic became a problem. He'd made that assessment after 2 interactions. The first was when Nora had flagged a drug interaction between 2 medications he'd ordered for a patient in Bay 4. She hadn't challenged him loudly. She'd simply said, "These 2 together have a serotonin interaction profile. It's in the literature from 2019. Do you want me to pull it?" He'd said he was aware of the literature and didn't need the nurse to pull it for him, and then he'd quietly changed the order 20 minutes later when he looked it up. The second was when she'd suggested a different imaging sequence for a trauma patient before he'd put in the order. The sequence she suggested would have produced equivalent diagnostic information in 40 minutes less time. He'd ordered his original sequence. It had taken 40 minutes longer. The patient had been fine, but Bragg had felt the weight of that gap. He hadn't addressed either incident directly. He'd begun routing his patients to other nurses when staffing allowed. He made small comments and handoffs, precise, careful comments that couldn't be easily disputed, about nursing staff maintaining appropriate scope of practice. The charge nurse noticed. Nora noticed. Nothing was said because nothing could be usefully said, and the department was 3 nurses short, and everyone had work to do. Nora had worked in environments with significantly more hostility than Curtis Bragg. She said nothing and did her job. She arrived at 11 on Thursday night and took report from the outgoing nurse without incident. The board showed 4 patients in various stages of workup. Nothing immediately critical. She washed her hands at the supply room sink, twice, a habit she'd developed in conditions that had permanently impressed upon her what happened when you skipped that step, clipped on a fresh set of gloves, and stepped into the Thursday night rhythm of the ER. By midnight, she had cleared 2 patients, caught a potassium level that would have triggered a dangerous rhythm in a third if it had gone unaddressed, and was mid-shift and working efficiently when Petra appeared at the curtain of Bay 2 with her voice in the register she used for things that were actually wrong. "Nora, Bay 3. Incoming. Bad one." Nora set the last labeled tube in the rack and snapped off her gloves. "What am I looking at?" "Highway 12. Logging truck versus 2 passenger vehicles. We've got 3 incoming, 1 priority 1. ETA 4 minutes." Nora was already moving. She pulled the crash cart, confirmed the defibrillator charge, checked the airway kit, confirmed the suction was working, pulled a trauma kit to the head of the bay, and positioned herself at the angle that would give her a clean line of sight and immediate access to the patient's upper body from the moment the gurney cleared the doors. She did all of it in 2.5 minutes, without rushing, because rushing looked like efficiency but produced errors, and she had learned to move at the speed where her hands were ahead of her thoughts, but not ahead of her judgment. Dr. Bragg arrived as the ambulance bay doors opened. He had his stethoscope around his neck and his expression arranged into the authority of an attending walking into a trauma, and he took his position at the foot of the incoming gurney. The patient was male, large frame, thick through the chest and shoulders, mid-40s, the kind of build that came from physical work over a long time. He was conscious, but barely, eyes half open and tracking without fixing, with the particular unfocused quality that meant the brain was present but not fully processing. His blood pressure came off the paramedic's radio at 82/50 and dropping. His right side was wrapped in a field dressing already soaked through. Nora was looking at his face. There was a scar along the underside of his jaw on the right side. It followed the curve of the mandible for about 4 centimeters and ended in a faint pucker of tissue that had healed well, neatly, better than you'd expect from field conditions, because the person who'd closed it had taken care. She had closed that wound 7 years ago in a casualty collection point that smelled like fuel and blood and diesel exhaust, on a night when she'd been awake for 31 hours and was operating on the particular focused clarity that kicks in when the body understands that stopping is not an option. She had sutured that jaw closed with a headlamp clipped to her kit because the light was gone and the bleeding wasn't. She looked at his chest. "BP's still falling," the paramedic said. He was responsive and combative at the scene, went quiet on transport. "Trachea appears mid-line, but we couldn't get a clean listen over road noise." "Right chest is lagging," Nora said. Bragg glanced at her with the expression he used when she said things before he'd reached a conclusion. "What?" "Watch the excursion. Left side is compensating. Right side is behind." She kept her voice even. "He's got diminished breath sounds on the right, and his pressure is still dropping despite the IV." Bragg took his stethoscope and listened. Left side, right side. He straightened. "Diminished on the right. Could be hemothorax from the chest wall injury. We'll get a portable chest x-ray and tension pneumothorax." Nora had her hands on the patient's chest now, feeling the asymmetry of the rise and fall with her palms. "He's not dropping pressure from blood loss alone. The right pleural space is filling with air, and it's starting to compress his mediastinum. Venous return is compromised. If we wait for imaging, we're going to watch him arrest while the film is being read." "We perform imaging before invasive intervention," Bragg said. "That is the protocol." "His trachea is going to shift in the next few minutes. Then his heart stops." "Step back, Callahan." The oxygen saturation alarm triggered. 87%. Then 85. The monitor produced the sound it made when it was telling you something you didn't want to hear. "Step back," Bragg repeated, louder. He turned to the tech near the door. "Get portable imaging in here now." 83, 81-1. The patient's color had changed. The gray-white of someone whose body was routing blood back to the core because there wasn't enough pressure to maintain the periphery. Nora went to the supply cart. She knew where the decompression kit was because she had personally restocked it 72 hours ago, and she made a practice of knowing exactly where everything was before she ever needed it. That practice had developed over years and in conditions where not knowing cost people their lives. She pulled a 14-gauge needle, 3.5 inches, and found the landmark by touch. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, right side. "Callahan." She inserted the needle. The sound came immediately, a rush of trapped air under pressure, the specific audible signature of a tension pneumothorax being relieved, and with it the kind of physiological shift that the monitors showed in real time. Oxygen saturation stopped dropping. 81. Then 83. Then over the next 90 seconds, 87, 91, 95. Blood pressure came up with it. 80/52, then 88/58, then 94/61 and climbing. Nora placed a flutter valve and stepped back. Her hands had not shaken. They didn't shake. She had a specific memory from a specific night a long time ago of deciding that her hands were not going to shake when she needed them, and whatever that decision had cost her in other ways, it had held. The monitor read 97/63, and the alarm had stopped. Bragg had not moved from his position at the foot of the bay. The respiratory therapist was looking at the monitor. The paramedic who had brought the patient in was looking at the monitor. Nobody in the room was looking at Bragg. The patient opened his eyes. They were dark gray, and they moved across the ceiling without finding anything, and then they dropped and found Nora's face, and they stayed there. He looked at her with the particular quality of someone whose brain is starting to come back online and is trying to reconcile what it's finding with what it remembers. His lips moved. "You're in the hospital," she said quietly. You're going to be okay. Don't try to talk right now. His eyes stayed on her face for another 4 seconds, like he was checking something, verifying something. Then they closed. Bragg spoke 3 words. Get the administrator. Warren Stahl had run Harlow Valley Medical Center for a decade with the polished efficiency of someone who had learned that administration was mostly about managing appearances and controlling information flow. He was 57, gray at the temples, and he wore his authority the way certain men wear good suits, as though it had always belonged to him and the idea of questioning it was slightly absurd. He arrived in the Trauma Bay corridor 19 minutes after Bragg called him, which meant he'd driven from home and had still taken the time to put on a jacket and tie before coming. He brought Dr. Bragg, a human resources coordinator named Phil, whose last name Nora didn't catch, and a manila folder. Nora was at the nurses' station finishing her documentation when they found her. She saw the folder. She saw Phil. She understood the meeting before Stahl said a word. Ms. Callahan. His voice had the quality of something that was being recorded, or might as well have been. We need to discuss what occurred in Trauma Bay 1 this evening. I performed a needle decompression to relieve a tension pneumothorax in a critically unstable patient, Nora said. I've documented the clinical rationale, the procedure, and the patient response. The documentation is complete. Dr. Bragg is the attending of record on that patient. Dr. Bragg ordered imaging. The patient's saturation was at 81 and dropping. He had approximately 60 to 90 seconds before cardiovascular collapse. Clinical decisions in this hospital are the responsibility of the attending physician, Stahl said. What you performed was an invasive procedure without physician authorization. That is a clear protocol violation regardless of the outcome. The outcome is that the patient is alive. The process is that nursing staff do not perform unauthorized invasive interventions. He opened the folder. This isn't the first time concerns have been raised about your approach to physician authority. Nora looked at the folder. She didn't reach for it. What's in the file? That will be addressed through the formal review process. Effective immediately, you are suspended pending that review. He slid the suspension notice across the counter. You'll need to surrender your badge and leave the building. She picked up the notice and read it. The language was careful, specific, and had clearly been written by someone who understood how to build a document that would hold up. Protocol violation, unauthorized clinical intervention. And the phrase she stopped on, pattern of conduct demonstrating disregard for established medical authority. Pattern, not incident. How many incidents are in this file? She asked. Stahl said nothing. You used the word pattern, she said. I'd like to know what's in the file. Ms. Callahan. His voice dropped the administrative register and became something flatter. Surrender your badge. Nora set the suspension notice on the counter. She unclipped her badge and placed it beside the notice. She picked up her canvas bag from under the station, collected her phone, and walked toward the ER exit. She'd left her jacket in the staff lounge. She didn't go back for it. Petra was in the corridor near Bay 2. She'd been there long enough to have heard most of it. She looked at Nora with an expression that had too much in it to sort through quickly. Something like fury, and something like helplessness, and something underneath those that Nora didn't have time to identify. Nora gave her a small nod and kept walking. She pushed through the ambulance bay doors. The October air was sharp and cold with the smell of pine and road salt coming down off the ridge. She stood on the ramp for a moment, not because she needed to collect herself, but because her body had developed the habit of taking one breath outside before deciding what came next, in every environment she'd ever worked in. Atlas was at the bottom of the ramp, sitting at perfect attention. No lead, no handler, just the dog, in the dark, watching the door with his ears forward and his tail still. He stood up the moment she appeared. Nora looked at him. Then she looked past him. Damon Reyes was standing in the parking lot, 30 feet back, with his hands in his jacket pockets, and an expression that was somewhere between apology and the look of someone who has been waiting and knew the waiting would eventually end this way. Behind Reyes, leaning against the hood of a black SUV with his arms crossed and his pale eyes on her face, was Jake Sutter. Atlas walked up the ramp and pressed the top of his head against her hip. She put her hand on the back of his neck, not for the dog's benefit, or not entirely. She stood there in the cold with her hand on the dog she hadn't seen in 4 years, fired and without a jacket, and with a suspension notice somewhere behind her that said pattern, and she let herself have exactly 4 seconds to simply stand there before she looked at Sutter. He pushed off the hood of the SUV and walked toward her. "We know who you are," he said. "You don't know anything about me." "Doc Calloway," he said. "7th Special Forces Group, 3 tours. You were attached to our unit the 3rd deployment." He paused. "I was in that casualty collection point the night you stitched that man's jaw back together. The patient in Trauma Bay 1. The name she'd been waiting for him to say arrived with a weight she hadn't fully anticipated. "His name isn't what's on the intake form," she said. "No," Sutter agreed. "He changed it 5 years ago. Same reason you changed yours." He watched her face. "He came to Creston Falls 3 weeks ago, not for medical care. He came because he found something, documentation of equipment failures at this hospital that were being covered up, and a pattern of employees who reported those problems and then disappeared from the payroll before they could go further with it." The cold air moved across the parking lot. 3 days ago, he stopped answering his phone, Sutter said. He was working with a source inside the hospital, someone who'd been quietly collecting documentation for months. The source went dark the same day he did. Nora's hand stayed on Atlas's neck. "What's the source's name?" Sutter looked at her for a moment. He had the look of a man delivering information he knows will land hard and has no way to soften. "Callahan," he said. "The source's name is Callahan." She went still. Atlas pressed his weight against her leg. "My brother," she said. Sutter nodded. Nora looked back at the hospital, the lit windows of the ER, the ambulance bay she'd just been walked out of. 4 years she'd spent in that building, and now she was looking at it from the outside holding a suspension notice that said pattern, a word that didn't happen by accident, a word that got into a file because someone built it there. Someone who had known there was a Callahan inside that hospital, collecting documentation. Someone who had decided to move first. She looked at Sutter. 24 hours, she said. Atlas sat down at her feet without being told. Perfect heel. Ears forward, waiting. Sutter didn't push for an answer on what 24 hours meant, or what she planned to do with it. That was one of the things Nora had always found useful about operators. They understood that asking someone to explain a plan they hadn't fully formed yet was a way of making the plan worse. He simply nodded, handed her a burner phone with one number already saved in it, and walked back to the SUV. Reyes collected Atlas with a short whistle. The dog went, but he looked back once. Nora stood in the parking lot until the SUVs pulled out. Then she stood there a little longer because she needed to think, and she thought better without an audience. Her brother's name was Colin Callahan. He was 28, 4 years younger than her, and he had taken a biomedical equipment technician job at Harlow Valley Medical Center 11 months ago. He hadn't told her he was doing it. She'd found out 3 months in when he'd called her on a Sunday afternoon, which he never did, and said he'd taken a job in Creston Falls and was she still living there and could they get dinner. She had not immediately assumed it was a coincidence. She wasn't built to assume coincidences. But Colin had seemed settled. He'd seemed like someone doing his job, fixing ventilators, calibrating infusion pumps, logging maintenance records, and building a life in a small Montana town that happened to be where his sister lived. He had an apartment on the north side of town and a second-hand truck and a habit of texting her pictures of particularly bad sunsets with no commentary. She had not pressed him on why he'd chosen Creston Falls specifically because she didn't press people on things until she needed to, and she hadn't needed to yet. She pulled out her personal phone and called him. It rang 7 times and went to voicemail. She called again. 7 rings. Voicemail. She stood in the parking lot and felt something she was practiced at not feeling, which was the particular cold that moves through you when the space where a person should be becomes audible in their phone not answering. She had felt it before, in places that had trained her to keep moving when she felt it, because stopping when that feeling came was a way of making whatever had caused it permanent. She called a 3rd time. "Hey!" Colin's voice, sleep-rough and slightly alarmed. "Nora, it's almost midnight. What? Are you home?" A pause. The sound of sheets. "Yeah, I was asleep. What's wrong?" "Are you at your apartment right now? Physically?" "Yes, why are you but I need you to stay there. Don't go out. Don't let anyone in you don't know, and don't go into work tomorrow until you talk to me first." She kept her voice even. It was easier than it should have been. "I'll explain in the morning." Another pause, longer. "Nora, what happened?" "I'll explain in the morning. Keep your phone on." She ended the call before he could ask more questions she didn't have answers to yet, got in her car, and drove. The town of Creston Falls at midnight was quiet, in the specific way of places where people worked physical jobs and went to bed early. The main street was lit and empty. The gas station near the highway interchange was the only thing fully open, fluorescent and isolated in the dark. Nora drove past it, turned north on a county road that ran along the base of the East Ridge, and let herself think. What she knew, her brother had been inside Harlow Valley Medical Center for 11 months. He was a biomedical equipment technician, which meant he had access to every piece of medical equipment in the building and the maintenance records that tracked their performance. Sutter had said he'd found documentation of covered-up equipment failures and a pattern of employees who reported problems and then disappeared. That was the kind of thing a biomedical tech would be positioned to see. Not just the failures themselves, but the gap between what the records said happened and what the equipment logs actually showed. What she didn't know, who else knew what Colin had found, how long they'd known it, and what they'd done about it beyond going quiet. What she suspected, the suspension notice with its carefully constructed word pattern, was not a coincidence of timing. Someone had moved against her tonight, the same night the man she'd saved 7 years ago, and again tonight, had come into her ER. That was not a coincidence either. She drove for 40 minutes without going anywhere specific, which was how she thought when she needed to think without her environment giving her things to react to. Then she drove back into town and parked 2 blocks from the hospital. She didn't go in. She didn't have a badge anymore. What she did was sit in her car and look at the building and run through what she knew about the layout of the biomedical equipment department, which was in the basement level, east wing, with its own service entrance on the side of the building that the loading dock shared. She knew that entrance. She'd used it during a code 3 years ago, when the main ER doors were blocked by an incoming helicopter. The keypad code had been the same then as it had been the last time she'd needed to use it, which was 8 months ago. People in hospitals were remarkably consistent about not changing access codes. She had nothing on her that constituted a plan. She had a burner phone, her personal phone, her car keys, and the clothes she'd been wearing for 14 hours. She also had, somewhere in the back of her car under a gym bag she hadn't opened in 2 weeks, a small flashlight she kept there because she'd been in enough situations where needing a flashlight and not having one was the specific difference between a bad outcome and a worse one. She found the flashlight. She checked the battery. She got out of the car. The service entrance code worked. Nora stood in the stairwell for a moment and listened. The hospital at midnight had its own particular sound. The HVAC running in the walls, distant monitors from the floors above, the low background noise of a building that never fully stopped. The basement was quieter than the rest. Storage rooms, mechanical infrastructure, the biomedical equipment department with its long workbench and the rows of equipment in various stages of maintenance. She didn't use her flashlight. The emergency lighting in the stairwell was enough, and a flashlight moving through a basement window at midnight would be visible from outside in a way that a person moving through existing lighting wouldn't be. Colin's workspace was the third door on the left. The door was unlocked, which meant either Colin had left it that way or someone else had been here recently and hadn't bothered to secure it. Nora noted both possibilities and pushed the door open. The room was as she'd seen it once before, when Colin had given her a brief tour in a spirit of showing off the job that she'd found unexpectedly touching. Long workbench running the length of the right wall, covered in tools and calibration equipment, and an infusion pump in partial disassembly. Filing cabinet against the back wall. A desktop computer. 2 ventilators on rolling frames tagged with yellow maintenance stickers. She went to the filing cabinet first. The top 2 drawers contained what you'd expect: calibration logs, equipment manuals, service records organized by equipment type. The third drawer was locked, which the others hadn't been. She noted it and moved to the computer. She didn't try to log in. She wasn't going to guess Colin's password, and attempting it would create an access log. What she did instead was look at the physical surface of the desk with the flashlight, because Colin had a specific habit she'd observed at his apartment. He wrote things down on paper and then lost the paper, which meant there were always small notes in various states of being lost around any workspace he occupied for more than a week. There was a yellow sticky note under the edge of the keyboard. She lifted the keyboard. The note had 4 letters and 6 numbers in Colin's handwriting, a file name format, the kind used for logging equipment service records. She memorized it, replaced the keyboard, and turned off the flashlight. She was on her way to the door when she heard the elevator. The basement elevator was the old freight model, slow and loud, and it was running. Coming down. She had approximately 12 seconds. She moved to the far side of the workbench, stepped behind the two ventilators on their rolling frames, and crouched. The position put her in shadow, with the ventilators between her and the door, and gave her a sightline through the gap between them. The elevator opened. 2 sets of footsteps in the corridor. They weren't hurrying, which meant they weren't responding to an alarm. They had a purpose that didn't require speed. The door to Colin's workspace opened. The first man through was someone Nora didn't recognize. 30s, in the unremarkable clothes of someone who wanted to be unremarkable, with the efficient way of moving through a space that suggested he'd been in it before. The second man was Phil from HR, still in his jacket from the meeting at the nurses' station 2 hours ago. Phil went directly to the filing cabinet. He had a key. The third drawer opened. Nora watched Phil remove a stack of documents and a USB drive and hand them to the first man, who put them in a bag. The first man said something she couldn't hear, and Phil nodded. Phil did not look comfortable. He looked like someone doing something he'd decided he had to do in a way that had separated from whether he wanted to do it. They were in the room for 4 minutes. They took the documents, the USB drive, and spent 60 seconds at the computer, not logging in, just removing something from the back of the tower that Nora realized, with a delay, was a second hard drive. The kind that got installed as a backup. The kind that someone who was carefully documenting things might use precisely because it wasn't on the network. Then they left. She stayed behind the ventilators for 2 full minutes after the elevator sound faded. Then she stood up, felt the specific ache of crouching on a concrete floor, and went to the now unlocked third drawer. It was empty except for one thing they'd missed, or not considered worth taking. A single manila envelope at the very back, pushed flat against the rear wall of the drawer. Inside were 6 pages of photocopied incident reports with handwritten notes in the margins. Colin's handwriting. The notes cross-referenced report numbers with dates, and beside several of the dates were names, employee names, she realized, reading quickly, cross-referenced with separation dates from employment. The pattern was visible even in 6 pages. Incident report filed, equipment failure noted, employee who filed it gone within 60 to 90 days. At the bottom of the last page, Colin had written a single line, deaths during same window. Need full OR logs, not just incident records. Nora put the 6 pages in the inside pocket of her scrub top, where they sat flat against her ribs. She pulled out the burner phone. She sent one text to Sutter's number. We have a problem. Meet me at the East Parking Structure, Level 2, 20 minutes. Sutter arrived in 17. He came alone, which Nora had expected. He leaned against the concrete pillar and listened without interrupting while she told him what she'd seen, what she'd found, and what Colin had written at the bottom of the last page. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Ore logs, he said. He thought people died. He thought the equipment failures weren't just near misses. Nora kept her voice level. He thought some of them went further and the records were adjusted afterward to remove the connection. Sutter processed that. The man you saved tonight, the patient, he was working this from the outside. Your brother was working it from the inside. They were building toward the same documentation. And someone in that hospital knows it. She paused. The HR coordinator and a man I didn't recognize were in my brother's workspace 2 hours after I was suspended. They had a key to the locked drawer. They took documents and a USB drive and a secondary hard drive. You think tonight's suspension was about moving you out before you could connect what your brother had found to what happened in the ER. I think the timing is not a coincidence. Sutter looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the parking structure entrance, the way he looked at entrances. We need someone inside that hospital who can access records you can't reach from outside. I know someone, Nora said, but I'm not involving her until I understand what we're actually dealing with. The patient in Trauma Bay 1, Sutter said. He needs to wake up. He was carrying information when he went dark. He had a contact inside the hospital who was going to hand him something. We don't know if the handoff happened. It didn't. Nora looked at him. The man I saw tonight with Phil, he wasn't hospital administration. The way he moved through that room. The way he went directly to the secondary drive without checking anything else first. He knew exactly what he was looking for and where it was. Meaning someone told him. Meaning someone told him before tonight. She paused. My brother's source went dark the same day as the patient. Sutter, what if dark doesn't mean what you thought it meant? The parking structure was silent for a moment. Colin called me tonight, she said. He was home. He was asleep. But someone has been inside his workspace and taken his documentation, and he doesn't know it yet. She put the burner phone in her pocket. I need to get him out of that apartment before he shows up for work tomorrow, and whoever moved tonight decides the next step is removing the witness instead of just the evidence. She woke Colin at 1:30 in the morning by knocking on his door. He answered it in a t-shirt and the expression of someone who had not actually gone back to sleep after her midnight call, which meant some part of him had already understood that this was not a normal call. He let her in. He looked at her face. He said, "How bad?" "Get a bag, enough for a week." "Nora, they were in your workspace tonight, the third drawer. They took everything in it except 6 pages in a manila envelope at the back." She pulled the envelope from her scrub top and held it out. "You missed these or you hid them. Either way, they're the only documentation still in the building." Colin stared at the envelope for a moment. He was quiet in a way that was different from sleep quiet. The quiet of someone whose worst-case scenario has just been confirmed and is now working out what to do with that confirmation. He took the envelope and looked at the pages. "I copied those from a set I had at home," he said finally. "The originals are on a drive." "The drive is gone." "I have a second one." He looked up. "It's not at the apartment. I put it somewhere else 3 weeks ago when I thought I was being careful." "Where?" He hesitated. Not because he didn't trust her, because saying it out loud made it real in a way that the events of the last hour were still becoming. "The dog," he said. Nora looked at him. "The patient, the man I was working with. He has a contact who works with military working dogs. I gave the drive to the contact 2 weeks ago because I needed it out of my possession, but somewhere I could recover it." He paused. "It's in Atlas's collar, the parking structure. Sutter leaning against the pillar. Atlas sitting at perfect attention in the ambulance bay." Nora stood very still. "You know him," Colin said. He was reading her face. "You know the dog." "Pack a bag," she said. "I'll explain in the car." Oh. Sutter took the news about the caller with the particular stillness of someone who had learned to absorb unexpected information without broadcasting a reaction. He made one call, said 4 words, "Check Atlas's collar, now," and listened. Then he said confirmed and ended it. The USB drive was there, embedded in the lining of the collar, wrapped in electrical tape, the size of a thumbnail. Reyes brought it to the parking structure in a waterproof case. Colin took it and held it the way people hold things, their surprise still exist. Sutter looked at the case and then at Nora. "We need somewhere to look at what's on it tonight," he said. "My apartment," Nora said, "but I want him moved first." She nodded at Colin. Sutter sent Reyes with Colin in one of the SUVs to a motel 20 miles up the highway that catered to hunters and didn't ask for more ID than a credit card. Then he followed Nora to her apartment in the second vehicle, 2 of his men coming up the stairs without being asked and taking positions in the hallway that were casual enough to read as people waiting, but positioned in a way that anyone coming through either stairwell door would immediately encounter. Nora's apartment was small and had the look of a place that was used for sleeping and not much else. Clean, minimally furnished, with the specific absence of personal accumulation that came either from indifference to objects or from a life spent in places where accumulating them wasn't practical. There was a good set of knives in the kitchen because she cooked when she could, and there were running shoes by the door that had real mileage on them, and on the shelf beside the bathroom there was a photograph she'd turned face down years ago and hadn't turned back. She opened her laptop. Colin had given her the drive's contents in a compressed archive before Reyes took him out of town. She extracted it. Sutter stood behind her left shoulder and read the screen. The archive contained 4 folders. The first was labeled Equipment Incidents, reported and contained 57 scanned incident reports filed by various hospital staff over a period of 14 months. The second folder, labeled Equipment Incidents, Actual, contained what appeared to be raw maintenance logs and service records for the same equipment, covering the same period. The third folder was a series of employment records, hire dates, performance reviews, and separation dates for 18 employees across 3 departments. The fourth folder was labeled Mortalities and contained 11 documents. Nora opened the first one. It was an internal record of a patient death, annotated in Collins' handwriting. The official cause listed was listed as a cardiac event during a routine procedure. Collins' annotation cross-referenced the date with a ventilator service log showing that the unit used during that procedure had flagged an internal pressure error 48 hours earlier, an error that appeared in the raw maintenance data but was absent from the official incident report for that equipment. The second document was similar. Different patient, different equipment, different department. The same gap between what the raw data showed and what the official record contained. By the fifth document, the gap had a shape. Nora sat back in her chair. "He built the whole case," she said. 14 months of it, Sutter said. Someone was systematically removing evidence of equipment failures from the official record and replacing it with clean data. When employees filed incident reports that came close to the truth, they were removed from the payroll before the reports could go anywhere. She looked at the screen. And during this same period, 11 patients died in circumstances where the equipment involved had a prior failure that wasn't disclosed. Sutter said nothing. "This hospital has been covering up patient deaths," Nora said. "Not negligence they missed. Negligence they found and buried." The burner phone in her pocket vibrated. She looked at the screen. The text was from a number she didn't have saved. 4 words. "They know about your brother." Then, 5 seconds later, a second text from the same number. "They're already moving." Nora was on her feet before the second text finished loading, and in the hallway, one of Sutter's men had already pushed off the wall and had his hand on his radio because his phone had vibrated at the same moment hers did, and whatever Sutter's network had just learned, it had reached all of them at the same time. Sutter came through the apartment door with his phone to his ear. He looked at Nora. "Someone accessed your brother's employment file in the hospital system 40 minutes ago," he said. "Not HR. Someone with administrative override. They pulled his emergency contact." Nora's emergency contact at Harlow Valley Medical Center was not her brother. It was her. Which meant whoever had just pulled Collins' emergency contact had also just found her address. Sutter was already moving when Nora grabbed her laptop and the USB drive off the table. She didn't take anything else. There was nothing else worth taking. The photograph on the bathroom shelf stayed face down where it had been for 3 years, and the good knives stayed in the kitchen, and she was through the apartment door in 14 seconds with her canvas bag and the drive in her jacket pocket. "Colin," she said. "Reyes is already calling the motel," Sutter said. He was at the stairwell door, holding it open, scanning the landing below. "He'll move him." "They have my address. They don't have the motel." "Not yet." That was not reassuring, and Sutter didn't try to make it sound like it was. They went down the stairs fast. One of Sutter's men, the one who had been stationed near the second stairwell door, a compact, dark-haired operator named Teller, came down behind them without needing to be told, and the other, a taller man named Garza, was already outside at the vehicle by the time they hit the ground floor. Nora noted their coordination without commenting on it. They moved the way people moved when moving together was something they'd done enough times that the communication happened before the words did. The street outside her building was quiet. 2 in the morning in Creston Falls, nothing moving. The black SUV was at the curb. She got in the back with Sutter and the drive pressed between her palm and her knee, and they were out of the block before she'd fully processed that she'd just left her apartment with no clear sense of when she'd be back. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Fort Dillon," Sutter said. She looked at him. "We have a secure space there, off the installation record. It's a support facility attached to a training range. Nobody accesses it through normal post channels." He had his phone out and was doing 3 things at once with the focused economy of someone who had been running operations for moving vehicles for 15 years. "The drive needs to be examined by someone who can authenticate the metadata, confirm the files haven't been altered, establish chain of custody. We have a forensic tech on base who can do that tonight. And Colin. Reyes is moving him now. He'll be at Fort Dillon within the hour." Nora looked out the window. The county road north, pine ridges black against the slightly lighter black of the sky, no other headlights in either direction. She thought about the patient in Trauma Bay 1, the man whose jaw she had stitched in a place she'd spent 7 years trying to put far enough behind her that it stopped showing up in the space between sleeping and waking. He was in that hospital right now, in a bed, with a chest that was working correctly because she had made it work correctly, and she had no access to that building anymore. She thought about the 11 files in Colin's 4th folder. 11 patients. Sutter, she said. Yeah. The patient, do you have someone watching him inside the hospital? A pause. We have eyes on the building, not inside. If whoever moved tonight decides the problem isn't the documentation, it's the witness. She stopped. She didn't need to finish it. Sutter's jaw set and he was on the phone before she got to the end of the sentence, saying something to Reyes in a low voice that she caught pieces of. Hospital, patient, liability, eyes inside by 0300. She didn't ask how he planned to get eyes inside a hospital at 2 in the morning. She had a reasonable guess. And the guess involved the kind of informal coordination that didn't go into any report anywhere. The drive to Fort Dillon took 53 minutes on roads that were dark and mostly straight. Nora didn't sleep. She sat with the USB drive in her hand and ran through what she knew in the order she knew it, the way she'd been trained to construct a situation assessment. Not what she felt about it, not what she feared about it, just what it actually was, laid out in sequence without the noise. What it actually was, a regional hospital had been falsifying equipment maintenance records for at least 14 months. Employees who documented the real data had been systematically removed from their positions. 11 patients had died during procedures involving equipment with prior failures that were deleted from official records. Her brother had spent 11 months building documentation of this. The man she'd saved tonight, twice now, counting the original deployment, had come to Creston Falls to receive that documentation and move it to people who could act on it. Someone inside the hospital had known about both of them and had moved tonight to remove the documentation and by extension the witnesses. She had been suspended. Her brother had been identified. The drives had been taken, except for the one she was holding. Stakes were clear. The shape of it was clear. What was not clear was who, above Warren Stahl and Curtis Bragg and Phil from HR, had the reach to pull this off for 14 months and the motivation to keep pulling it off. Because covering up equipment failures that killed patients was not something a hospital administrator did for internal political reasons. That was the kind of thing that had money behind it, and money behind it meant something larger than Harlow Valley Medical Center's balance sheet. She was still thinking about that when the SUV turned off the county road onto an unmarked drive that ran between two wire fences into the dark, and Sutter said, "We're here," to no one in particular. The support facility was 3 low buildings inside a perimeter fence, lit with the yellow-white of security lighting that made everything look slightly unreal. A woman met them at the door of the middle building, 30s, sharp-faced, in civilian clothes with the posture of someone who had spent time in uniform and not entirely left it behind. She introduced herself as Vasquez, didn't offer a first name, and looked at the USB drive in Nora's hand with the focused attention of someone who had been waiting for it. "Forensic imaging first," Vasquez said. "Then we look at the content. I need to establish that the files haven't been modified since creation before anything on that drive gets used for anything." "How long?" Sutter asked. "Depends what's on it. 90 minutes minimum." She took the drive and went through an interior door. Colin arrived 40 minutes later with Reyes, in dry clothes and a jacket that wasn't his, carrying nothing except his phone. He looked at Nora, and she looked at him. And they didn't hug because they weren't people who hugged, but he sat down next to her on the metal bench along the wall, and their shoulders were touching, which was the Callahan version of the same thing. "You okay?" she asked. "I've been better." He looked at the floor. "I've also been worse." "Tell me the timeline. Start from when you took the job." He did. It took 20 minutes, and he told it straight. No dramatics, no self-justification, just the sequence of events in the order they happened, which was how Nora had always preferred to receive information and which Colin had figured out about her sometime in their late teens. He had taken the biomedical tech position at Harlow Valley because a former colleague, a woman named Dana Price, who had worked there for 2 years before being terminated, had reached out to him. Dana had been an equipment technician. She'd been fired 8 months before Colin arrived, and she'd spent the time between her termination and contacting Colin documenting, from memory and from copies of records she'd retained, a pattern she hadn't fully understood while she was inside it, but that had become clearer as she built the picture from the outside. Dana had lost her job because she filed an incident report on a ventilator that had malfunctioned during a post-surgical patient's recovery. The patient had died. The official record said the ventilator had performed within normal parameters. Dana's own maintenance log said otherwise. She'd been terminated for what her file described as repeated failure to follow established documentation protocols. She contacted me because I had a certification she needed, Colin said. Someone who could go in, access the system, and verify that what she remembered seeing in the raw equipment data matched what was actually still in the system versus what was in the official reports. She needed someone who wouldn't already be on their radar, Nora said. Right. A new employee with clean history and no connection to anyone they'd already removed. He paused. She didn't tell me you were there. I found that out after I took the job. And you didn't tell me. No. He didn't apologize for it. Because if I'd told you, you would have told me not to do it, and you would have had reasons, and the reasons would have been right, and I would have done it anyway, and we would have had a fight about it on top of everything else. Nora thought about that. He wasn't wrong about any part of it. How far did you get before they started to notice you? I think I had about 8 months before anything changed. Then about 6 weeks ago, one of the documents I accessed was flagged. Not an alert I could see, something on the administrative side. I didn't know about it until the patient made contact and told me his source inside the building had indicated the flag. His source. There's someone still inside, Colin said. Not biomedical, clinical staff. They've been providing him with information from the patient care side, procedure records, OR logs, the data I couldn't access directly. He looked at her. I don't know who it is. He didn't tell me. Compartmentalization. Nora filed that and moved on. Dana Price. Where is she now? That's the part I didn't tell Sutter yet. Colin looked at his hands. I don't know. She was my external contact. 3 days ago, she stopped responding. Same day the patient went dark. The room was quiet except for the HVAC and the distant sound of Vasquez working in the next room. 3 people went quiet on the same day, Nora said. I know. And then tonight, I know Nora. She looked at him. He was 28 years old and he had the particular expression of someone who understood, fully and without cushion, the weight of what he'd put in motion. Not regret exactly. Something more complicated than regret. The expression of someone who would do it again and knew the cost of doing it again and was sitting with both of those things at the same time. She put her hand on his arm for a moment. Then she stood up and went to find Sutter. Vasquez emerged from the forensic room at 4:17 in the morning with a printed summary and an expression that had settled into the specific flatness of someone who has found something worse than they expected. The files are authentic, she said. Metadata is intact. Creation timestamps are consistent with the period documented. No evidence of post-creation modification. She set the summary on the table. The drive contains what it says it contains. Sutter picked up the summary. He read the first page and didn't say anything. There's something else, Vasquez said. The vendor data in folder 2, what? The maintenance contract records. I cross-referenced the equipment serial numbers against the federal procurement database. She paused. 7 of the 11 pieces of equipment involved in the mortality cases were purchased through a federal medical supply contract, specifically a Department of Defense medical equipment procurement program that supplies regional civilian hospitals in rural areas as part of a joint civilian-military health infrastructure initiative. Nora looked at her. The equipment was federally procured, Vasquez said, which means the falsified maintenance records aren't just a state medical licensing issue. They're potentially a federal contract fraud issue. And if patients died because of failures in federally procured equipment that was then deliberately misrepresented in records connected to a federal program, she stopped. That's not a hospital administration problem anymore. That's a federal criminal matter, Sutter said. At minimum. Vasquez looked at Nora. Your brother's documentation doesn't just show a hospital cover-up. It shows that someone was falsifying records connected to federal procurement. And given the scope and duration, that almost certainly didn't happen without someone at the procurement level knowing about it. The room had the quality of a space where the gravity of something has just shifted perceptibly. Who handles the federal medical procurement program for this region? Sutter asked. I'm already running it, Vasquez said. Give me an hour. What? The hour became 90 minutes. Nora spent them at the table with Colin and a cup of coffee that was functional rather than good, going through the printed summary and building, on paper, the clearest sequence she could construct of what had happened and in what order. It was a habit from years in environments, where the moment things went wrong was rarely the moment you had time to think about them. You thought before, when you had the time, so that during, when you didn't, your brain had somewhere to return to. At 6:10 in the morning, the door opened and Sutter came back in with Vasquez and a third person Nora hadn't seen before. He was somewhere in his early 50s, with the look of someone who worked for the federal government in a capacity that wasn't publicly listed. Gray sport coat, no tie, and eyes that moved through the room the same way Sutter's did. Not threatening, just professionally systematic. "This is Agent Darren Okafor," Sutter said. "Department of Justice, Inspector General's office. He was already in Montana." Nora looked at Sutter. "Already?" she said. "The investigation into the federal procurement program has been running for 4 months," Okafor said. He sat down at the table without being invited. "We had evidence of procurement irregularities in 3 states. Montana was one of them. Harlow Valley Medical Center was flagged as a likely point of contract fraud 6 weeks ago." He looked at the drive sitting on the table. "We didn't have what's on that." "You knew about the hospital," Nora said, "for 6 weeks. We knew about the procurement side. We didn't have the clinical data, the maintenance records, the falsified incident reports, the mortality connection. That's the piece that completes the picture." He looked at her directly. "The people you're up against aren't just hospital administration. There's a supply company, Renfield Medical Systems, that holds the federal procurement contract for this region. The evidence indicates they've been providing equipment they knew had recurring failure issues, documenting it as compliant, and splitting the cost savings with hospital administrators who agreed to keep the failures off the books." Colin was very still on the bench beside Nora. "How many hospitals?" he asked. Okafor looked at him. "In Montana alone, 3. Across the program, we're looking at 8 confirmed sites and potentially more." He paused. "The mortality numbers you documented for Harlow Valley, the 11 cases, those are consistent with what we've been modeling for the other sites. We believe the total patient impact across all sites is significantly higher." The sun was coming up outside the wire-fenced perimeter, the specific gray-pink of a Montana dawn that had no interest in the things happening beneath it. Nora looked at the window for a moment. "The patient in Trauma Bay 1, she said. "He's still in that hospital." "We're aware. He came to Creston Falls to receive documentation from my brother and move it to someone who could act on it. He has been in that hospital since last night, with a staff that includes at minimum Warren Stahl, Curtis Bragg, and at least one other person who was in my brother's workspace at midnight removing evidence. If they've identified who he is, we have an agent positioned in the hospital as of 0400, Okafor said. "Nursing staff, night rotation. She's been briefed." "One agent," Nora said. "It's what we could move without triggering a response. If we go in heavy right now, before we have the full chain established, whoever is above Stahl and Bragg in this operation walks, and we lose the prosecution." He looked at her steadily. "We need 48 hours to get a federal preservation order covering the hospital's records and execute it simultaneously with a coordinated action. 48 hours where the patient stays in that hospital under watch, and nobody in the hospital knows the investigation has moved to this level." Nora thought about the patient in the bed, the scar under his jaw, the dark gray eyes finding her face when he came back online. "He's post-procedure," she said. "He had a tension pneumothorax last night and a decompression. He's going to be in a monitored bed for at least 72 hours, which means he's accessible to anyone on that floor with a legitimate reason to be there." She paused. "Or an illegitimate one." "I know. And Dr. Bragg is the attending of record. The physician who wanted to let him die rather than acknowledge a correct clinical call from a nurse has now been identified by that same patient as—" She stopped. "Does Bragg know who the patient is?" Okafor was quiet for a half-second too long. "What?" Nora said. "We don't know," Okafor said. "Stahl accessed the patient's intake record at 0200 this morning. Whether he found what he was looking for depends on what name the patient checked in under and what documentation he used." "What name did he use?" Sutter answered that one. "Clean alias. It'll hold for 48 hours, possibly more." He paused. "But the intake records are only part of it. If anyone in that building recognized him—" "He was brought in unconscious," Nora said. "The only person in that building who would recognize him is me." The sentence landed in the room and nobody argued with it. She looked at Okafor. "I need to get back into that hospital." "You're suspended." "I know I'm suspended. I also know that the only person in that building who will recognize a clinical deterioration in that specific patient before it becomes a code is me, Because I know his injury history in a way no one else in that ER does. She kept her voice even. It was not an easy thing to keep even at this particular moment. If he goes into cardiac tamponade, if the pericardial space starts filling post-decompression, which is a known complication of the mechanism of injury he presented with, the symptoms can be subtle enough in the early stages that a physician who isn't looking for it won't catch it. Okafor looked at her for a moment. He had the look of a federal agent doing a rapid assessment of whether a civilian was telling him something he needed to hear or something they needed to say. "You said cardiac tamponade," he said, specifically. "I did." "Because?" "Because I know what I did, and I know what I didn't do." The decompression relieved the pneumothorax, but the chest wall trauma that caused it also creates the conditions for pericardial effusion. If there was any cardiac contusion in the impact, which I couldn't assess last night because I was walked out of the building before I could complete a secondary survey, the fluid can accumulate slowly, quietly. The classic presentation is the triad: hypotension, muffled heart sounds, and distended neck veins. But in a patient with that body type, in a monitored bed where the numbers are being watched but not interpreted, someone could miss it, Okafor said. "Someone could miss it until it's a code," Nora said, "and then it's too late." The room was quiet. Sutter looked at Okafor. Okafor looked at the table. He was doing the calculation that federal agents did when the operational plan met a variable that hadn't been in the plan. The calculation between the risk of the variable and the risk of the modification. "If I get you into that building," he said finally, "it can't be as hospital staff. Your suspension is on record. If you're seen providing care—" "I'm not asking to provide care," Nora said. "I'm asking to be in the building, one floor above the ICU step down where he's being held, in a position where I can get to him in under 60 seconds if something changes." "And if something does change?" She looked at him. "Then I provide care," she said, "and we deal with the paperwork afterward." Okafor made 3 calls in the next 20 minutes. Nora didn't ask who he was calling. She drank the rest of her bad coffee and looked at the drive sitting on the table and thought about 48 hours. The shape of 48 hours. What could happen in it? What needed to happen in it? And what would happen to 11 families if the documentation on that drive didn't make it into the hands of people who could use it properly? She thought about Dana Price, who had lost her job and spent 8 months building a case from memory because a ventilator had failed and a patient had died and the record had been rewritten to say it hadn't. She thought about the 18 employees in Colin's folder, 18 people who had seen something wrong, documented it, and been quietly removed before the documentation could go anywhere. She thought about the word pattern in her suspension notice and the specific anger she felt about it. Not the hot anger of someone who had been wronged and needed everyone to know it, but the cold, precise anger of someone who understood exactly what the word had been meant to do and intended to be very deliberate about what she did in response. Okafor came back and said, "I can get you a hospital visitor credential that will pass a front desk check. You'll go in as a patient-family liaison from an external advocacy organization. There's a real organization. They have real credentials. The detail will hold for the..." He looked at her. "You go to the 3rd floor family waiting area. You stay there unless..." "Unless something changes," Nora said. "Unless something changes." She nodded. Colin stood up from the bench. "I'm going with her." "No," both Nora and Okafor said, at the same time, with enough combined certainty that Colin sat back down without arguing. Vasquez drove her. They didn't talk much. The sun was fully up by the time they reached Creston Falls, the pine ridges lit gold and the valley flat and still, the town beginning its morning with no visible awareness that anything had shifted in the night. Harlow Valley Medical Center stood at the north end of Maine, the same building it had been 24 hours ago. The same lit windows and ambulance bay, the same automatic doors at the main entrance. Nora walked in with the visitor credential clipped to the breast pocket of a jacket Vasquez had found in the back of the SUV. Civilian, nondescript, nothing that would read as medical. She went to the front desk, gave the name on the credential, said she was there to follow up on a patient liaison case, and was pointed toward the elevator with the brief disinterest of a front desk worker at 6:45 in the morning who had more important things to manage than visitor paperwork. 3rd floor. Family waiting area. Beige chairs, a low table with outdated magazines, a window that looked out over the parking lot. She sat down in the chair closest to the door. The step-down unit where the patient was being held was 1 floor below her. 43 steps, if the stairwell layout matched what she remembered from the one time she'd been on that side of the building. She sat. She watched the door. She had been sitting for 22 minutes when her phone, the burner, vibrated. The text was from Okafor's number. 3 words. Bragg just called Stahl. She stared at the screen. Then a second text, 8 seconds later. Stahl is heading to the patient's floor. Nora was already out of the chair. She hit the stairwell door at a walk, not a run, because running in a hospital drew eyes, and drawing eyes right now was the last thing she needed. Took the stairs to the second floor, came out into the corridor of the step-down unit, and oriented fast. Nurses stationed to the left, rooms numbered in ascending order to the right. The patient in room 214 according to the intake record Okafor had given her. She counted rooms. 208, 210, 212. Warren Stahl was 20 feet ahead of her, moving toward 214 with the specific purposefulness of someone who had made a decision and was executing it. And he had a man with him that Nora recognized, the same unremarkable man from Colin's workspace at midnight. The one who had taken the documents and the drive and the secondary hard drive with the smooth efficiency of someone who had done it before. They reached 214 first. Stahl pushed open the door. Nora was moving before she had a plan because sometimes the plan and the movement had to happen simultaneously and you sorted the plan out on the way. She came through the door 4 seconds after Stahl, and what she saw in the room made everything in her go very still and very cold and very focused simultaneously. The patient was awake. He was sitting up slightly in the bed, and his color was wrong. Not dramatically wrong, but wrong in the specific way that Nora had been trained to read, the gray around the edges quality of a cardiovascular system that was not fully compensating. His neck veins were distended. He was breathing, but the breathing had the slightly labored quality of someone working harder than they should be to move air. Stahl was standing at the foot of the bed. Mr. He looked at the chart in his hand. Mr. Harlan. I'm Warren Stahl, the hospital administrator. I wanted to check in personally on your care. The patient looked at Stahl. He didn't say anything. The unremarkable man had positioned himself near the door, between the door and the bed, in a way that was not aggressive enough to report, but was unambiguous to anyone who knew what they were looking at. Nora walked to the patient's bedside. Excuse me, Stahl's voice sharpened. This is a patient room. His blood pressure's dropping, Nora said. She was not looking at Stahl. She was looking at the monitor above the bed. 91/58. The number had been 97/63 when she'd last seen it. He needs a cardiac ultrasound right now. You are suspended. He has cardiac tamponade. She said it to the monitor, to the room, to the recording she hoped Okafor had running somewhere. Pericardial effusion post-trauma, classic Beck's triad. He is going to arrest in the next 15 to 20 minutes without intervention. The patient was looking at her. His dark gray eyes were clearer than they'd been last night. The anesthesia of shock had worn off, and he was fully present and aware. And they were looking at her the way they had looked at her from the hospital gurney, checking something, verifying something, finding something confirmed. You know who I am, he said. His voice was rough but clear. I do, Nora said. Can you fix this? Stahl took a step toward her. Ms. Callahan, if you do not leave this room immediately, I will have security. Can you fix it? The patient said again. His voice was still even. He was asking the way people asked when they knew the answer might be no and needed to hear it anyway. The monitor alarm triggered 87/52. Nora looked at Stahl. She looked at the man near the door. Call a code or get out of my way, she said. Stahl didn't move. The man near the door didn't move. The monitor read 84/49, and the alarm was a continuous sound now, not the intermittent warning, but the sustained tone that meant the threshold had been crossed, and the machine had run out of ways to be polite about it. Nora didn't wait for either of them. She hit the call button on the wall panel beside the bed, the emergency pull that went directly to the nurse's station rather than routing through the standard request queue, and she said to the patient in a voice that was level because level was what he needed. I need you to stay as still as you can. Try not to talk. He nodded once. His face had the quality of someone managing pain through stillness rather than the absence of it. The door opened and a nurse came in, young, second or third year by her movement patterns, and she stopped when she saw the room configuration. The monitor alarm. Nora at the bedside, Stahl at the foot of the bed, with an expression that had curdled from authority into something less stable. "Get Dr. Morant, Nora said to her. "Not Bragg. Morant. Tell her I need a portable cardiac ultrasound at bedside in room 214 right now, and I need a pericardiocentesis tray on standby." She looked at the nurse directly. "Do you understand what I just said?" "Yes, but—" The nurse looked at Stahl. "If you wait for him to decide," Nora said, "this patient goes into PEA arrest in the next 10 minutes, and you will run a code on a man who didn't have to code. That's what you'll carry." She kept her voice even, not cruel, just true. "Get Morant." The nurse left. Stahl found his voice. "You have no authority in this building." "Correct," Nora said. She was checking the patient's radial pulse against the monitor readout. The pulse was weaker than the number suggested, which was consistent with what she was looking at. "I'm not operating under hospital authority. I'm a person in a room with a man who is going to die if someone doesn't act in the next few minutes. You're welcome to call security. That'll take about 4 minutes, which is roughly when the window closes." The unremarkable man near the door had his phone out. He was looking at Stahl. Stahl looked at the monitor. He looked at the patient. He looked at Nora. Something crossed his face that was not a decision so much as the collapse of the alternative, the moment when maintaining the position costs more than releasing it. He stepped back from the foot of the bed. The unremarkable man put his phone in his pocket and left the room, which Nora noted and filed away for later. Dr. Sheila Morant came through the door 3 minutes later with the cardiac ultrasound unit and a resident behind her who was carrying the procedural tray with the slightly wide-eyed focus of someone who had been briefed on the run and was processing the briefing in real time. Morant was 51, with the particular authority of a physician who had been in enough emergency situations to have stopped performing authority and simply exercised it. She looked at the monitor. She looked at the patient. She looked at Nora. "Talk to me," she said. "Blunt chest trauma. Mechanism consistent with significant force to the right anterior chest. Tension pneumothorax decompressed last night. He was stable post-procedure, but the numbers started dropping approximately 20 minutes ago. Distended neck veins. Muffled sounds on auscultation. Pressure trending down. Radial pulse is weaker than the monitor reflects." Nora stepped back from the bedside to give Morant room. Classic presentation. Morant was already placing the ultrasound probe. The image came up on the screen. Grainy, real-time, the chambers of the heart surrounded by the anechoic black of fluid accumulation in the pericardial sac. Significant, more than significant. "That's a large effusion," the resident said, in the voice of someone reporting what they're seeing without having the experience yet to modulate the alarm in it. "I can see that," Morant said. She looked at the patient. "Sir, I need to drain fluid from around your heart. I'm going to give you a local anesthetic. Do you consent to this procedure?" The patient looked at Nora. She gave him a small nod. "Yes," he said. Morant looked at Stahl, who was still in the room. "Mr. Stahl, you need to leave." Stahl left. "What?" The pericardiocentesis took 11 minutes. Nora stood at the back of the room, out of the procedural field but present, and watched Morant work with the focused efficiency of a physician who had done this before and was not going to do it poorly under pressure. The resident handed instruments without being asked twice. The fluid came off in stages, dark, consistent with the hemopericardium that developed when trauma damaged the pericardial vessels. And with each stage, the numbers on the monitor improved in the incremental real-time way that made the connection between the intervention and the result impossible to miss. 92/61. 97, 103/68. The patient's color changed. Not immediately, not in the dramatic movie version way, but over 5 minutes. The gray receding, the underlying circulation reasserting itself. When Morant finished and stepped back, she looked at the monitor for a long moment. Then she looked at Nora. "How did you know?" she asked. "Mechanism of injury and incomplete secondary survey last night," Nora said. "I didn't get to finish the assessment before I was walked out." Morant was quiet for a moment. The resident was documenting, head down, stylus moving. "Bragg was the attending last night," Morant said. "Yes." The way Morant said nothing in response to that communicated considerably more than a response would have. She ordered a repeat ultrasound in 4 hours, adjusted the monitoring parameters, spoke to the patient briefly and clearly about what had happened and what to expect, and left the room. The resident followed. Nora stayed. The patient was looking at the ceiling. The oxygen saturation read 98%, and his blood pressure was holding at 101/66. He looked like someone who had just been on the wrong side of a close margin and was in the process of understanding that the margin had gone the right way. "You came back," he said. "I was in the building," Nora said. "That's the same thing." He turned his head to look at her. "You know what's in the hospital." "I know what's in the hospital," she said, "and so do the people who need to know it." He held her gaze for a moment. "Dana Price." "We haven't located her yet." Something moved across his face. "She reached out to me 6 weeks ago. She had the original equipment logs, physical copies she'd retained when she was terminated. She was supposed to meet a contact 3 days ago." He paused. "She didn't show." "Do you have a location? An address? Anything she gave you?" "She was staying at a rental property outside Creston Falls. She sent me the address when we set the meeting." He looked at her. "My phone was in the vehicle when I was brought in. I don't know where it is now." Nora thought about the intake process. Patient belongings, bagged and tagged, held in the secure storage room adjacent to the nurse's station on this floor. "I'll find it," she said. She was at the door when he said her name, not the name on her badge, the one that had belonged to her before she'd put it away. She turned. "The men who came into this room," he said, "the administrator. I've seen the other one before, at a hospital in Billings 14 months ago. He was there the day a technician named Price was escorted out of the building." Nora stood in the doorway. "You're certain," she said. "I don't forget faces," he said. She left. Okafor was in the family waiting room on the 3rd floor when she got there. He had not been there when she'd come through earlier, which meant he'd moved into the building while she'd been in the room, which meant his timeline had accelerated. He looked at her when she walked in and said, "He's stable?" "For now." She sat down across from him. "The man who was with Stahl this morning, one of your agents needs to locate him right now. He was at a hospital in Billings 14 months ago when Dana Price was terminated. He's not hospital administration." Okafor's expression did not change dramatically, but something behind it did. "Description." She gave it. He typed something on his phone. "Price," she said. "She was staying at a rental property outside Creston Falls. The patient sent her the address 3 days ago, and she missed a meeting. We need that address. The patient's phone is in belongings storage on this floor. If you can get it released, I can get the address." Okafor stood up and went to the nurse's station. He was back in 6 minutes with a phone in a sealed belongings bag. He handed it to Nora. She opened the bag, found the message thread. The patient's phone had a different name on it, the alias, but the messages were there, and read the address back to Okafor, who was already on his phone before she finished the second line. She sat with the phone in her hands after he moved away to make the call, and she looked at the message thread. 3 days of messages from Dana Price that started with logistics and timing and ended on the day she went silent with a single text that said, "I think someone followed me from town. Going to stay inside tonight and reassess in the morning." After that, nothing. The morning had been 3 days ago. Okafor sent 2 agents to the rental property address within the hour. He didn't tell Nora what they found when they got there. He came back to the waiting room, sat down and said, "She's alive. She's been in that house for 3 days. She didn't leave because she was genuinely concerned she was being followed and she'd lost her external contact when the patient went dark." He paused. "She has the original physical copies. Everything Colin replicated digitally, she has in hard copy with her own contemporaneous notes." Nora let out a breath she'd been holding in some form for approximately 12 hours. 2 independent datasets, she said, digital and physical, authenticated separately, chain of custody on both. Okafor leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. "This morning I submitted an emergency application for a federal preservation order covering Harlow Valley Medical Center's electronic records, paper records, personnel files, vendor contracts, and communications. The order was granted 40 minutes ago." Nora looked at him. "That's why I'm in the building," he said. "We're executing it now. Hospital records are being imaged as we speak. Nobody on the administrative staff has been informed yet. Stahl? is in his office and will remain unaware until the building is secured. He looked at her steadily. I need you to understand that the next several hours are going to be disruptive. Staff are going to see federal agents in the building. Patients are going to need to be managed. The nursing staff and clinical teams are not under investigation, and their work needs to continue without interruption, which means someone needs to brief the charge nurse, Nora said. Yes. Petra Wolf. Yes. She already knows something is wrong, Nora said. She's been knowing it for months and not having the vocabulary to name it. Give me 10 minutes with her. What? Petra was in the ER charge office, which was where Petra was most mornings, working through the staffing matrix for the week, with the focus of someone who had long since accepted that the staffing matrix was always going to be a problem, and the only productive response to a problem was to work it. She looked up when Nora appeared in the doorway without a badge, and with an expression Petra had never seen on her in 4 years. Nora, her voice was careful. You're not supposed to be. I know, I need 5 minutes. Close the door. Petra closed the door. Nora told her what she needed to know and nothing more than that. Federal investigation, preservation order, agents in the building, clinical operations were to continue without interruption. Nobody on the patient care staff was under investigation. She kept it sequential and clear and didn't editorialize. And Petra listened the way Petra listened to things, which was with total stillness and the expression of someone processing rather than reacting. When Nora finished, Petra was quiet for a moment. The equipment failures, she said. The incident reports that went nowhere. Yes. I filed 3 of them in the last 2 years. Petra looked at the wall. Not at anything on the wall, just not at Nora. A ventilator discrepancy in the ICU, an infusion pump calibration issue in post-surgical, a medication delivery system that I logged twice and both times the follow-up record came back clear when it shouldn't have. Were you ever? No, they didn't come after me. Petra turned back. Because I wasn't a tech. I was charge. They couldn't separate me out cleanly without causing a staffing disruption they didn't want. So the reports just went nowhere. She paused. I knew they went nowhere. I didn't know why. Nora looked at her. 3 people knew why, Petra said. And one of them is lying in a step-down bed on 2 because you went back into this building this morning. She straightened. What do you need from me? Keep the ER running, Nora said. Keep your staff calm when they start seeing agents in the corridors. And if Bragg tries to remove himself from the building in the next 2 hours, call this number. She wrote Okafor's number on a post-it from Petra's desk. Don't try to stop him yourself. Petra looked at the number. She looked at Nora. Are you coming back? She asked. Not a sentimental question, a logistical one. I don't know yet, Nora said. That what happened next took most of the morning and had none of the clean sequential momentum that planning sessions suggested it would. The federal preservation order covered Harlow Valley Medical Center's systems comprehensively, but comprehensive coverage of a functioning hospital's record systems required pulling from multiple servers across multiple departments, and each pull required a hospital IT technician to provide access credentials under the supervision of Okafor's forensic team, and the hospital IT director initially refused on the grounds that he needed to consult with hospital legal counsel before complying, which cost them 47 minutes, while Okafor's team explained with increasing specificity what the words Federal Preservation Order meant for the IT director's personal cooperation obligations. Warren Stahl was notified of the order at 9:14 in the morning. Okafor conducted the notification himself, with 2 agents present in Stahl's office. Nora wasn't there for it, but Okafor's briefing afterward described a man whose performance of composure lasted about 90 seconds before the composure became something else. Not panic exactly, but the particular quality of a person whose internal calculation has just shifted from, how do I control this, to how bad is this going to be? Stahl asked for his attorney. Okafor told him he could call his attorney and was welcome to do so, and that in the meantime the preservation order would continue to be executed. Dr. Curtis Bragg was located in the surgical wing at 9:40 and notified that federal agents wished to speak with him. He said he was between procedures and would be available at 11. The agent who delivered the notification told him the conversation would happen at 9:45 and that his schedule would accommodate it, and that was how it happened. Nora learned the shape of these events in pieces, from Okafor's updates, and from what filtered through the hospital in the specific way that information filtered through hospitals. Not officially, but through the staff communication network that operated in break rooms and corridor conversations, and the looks exchanged between people who'd worked in the same building for years and could read the temperature of it without anyone having to explain. By 10 in the morning, the ER nursing staff knew something significant was happening on the administrative level. By 10:30, the general shape of it, federal investigators, records, administration, had moved through the building with the efficiency of information moving through a space where people were already primed to receive it because they'd been watching the shape of the wrong thing for longer than anyone had named it. Nora was back on the third floor when Okafor found her at 11:15. "Access logs from the hospital records system," he said. He had a tablet in his hand. "Forensic team pulled them this morning. We have timestamp data on every modification made to equipment incident reports in the last 14 months. Stahl's credentials. Stahl's credentials on some of them, but also administrative override codes, the kind that don't attach to a specific user account." He turned the tablet toward her. "Except they do, if you pull the secondary server log that nobody remembered to also falsify. The override codes were generated from Stahl's office terminal on 17 separate occasions. And on 6 occasions, they were generated from a terminal in the medical supply receiving department." Nora looked at the screen. The receiving department. The connection point between the hospital and the vendor. "Renfield Medical Systems," she said. "Their regional account representative has a standing access credential to that terminal," Okafor said. "It was set up 3 years ago as part of the procurement contract. Standard vendor access." He paused. "It was used to modify hospital records on 6 occasions over the last 14 months. Someone at the vendor level was reaching into the hospital's record system directly," Nora said, "using credentials that Stahl authorized and that were never flagged because the access was technically within the parameters of the vendor agreement." Okafor lowered the tablet. "We executed a simultaneous preservation order on Renfield Medical Systems offices in Helena this morning. The federal procurement fraud investigation has been formally linked to this case." The hallway outside was quiet, in the particular way it gets when a floor is running below its normal activity level, the sound of things continuing to function while the larger structure around them is being actively disassembled. "The 11 patients," Nora said. "The mortality review is going to take time," Okafor said, "but the preliminary connection between the documented equipment failures and the mortality dates is strong enough that the state medical examiner has opened a formal review." He held her gaze. "That's not going to be resolved today. It's going to take months, but it's going to happen." Nora thought about 11 families who had been told their person died from a cause that was documented to look like something it wasn't. She thought about what months meant when you'd been carrying the wrong explanation for a year or more. She didn't say anything about it because there was nothing to say that would make the months shorter. "Dana Price," she said. "She's been brought to Fort Dillon. She's safe. She's given a preliminary statement." He paused. "She asked about you specifically. She knew your brother had a sister in the hospital. She said—" He stopped. "What?" "She said she'd heard about a nurse in the ER who kept filing accurate reports and having them go nowhere. She thought if she could have identified you earlier—" He seemed to reconsider completing the sentence. "We'd have had a third data set," Nora said. "She said she thought you were the kind of person who would have kept copies." Nora thought about the 3 incident reports she had filed in 4 years. A medication delivery discrepancy, a documentation gap in a post-surgical chart, an equipment calibration concern she'd flagged directly to biomedical. She thought about the follow-up on each one, which had been nothing. She thought about how she'd noted the nothing and moved on because she hadn't yet had the connective tissue that would have told her the nothing was a pattern rather than an institutional oversight. She hadn't kept copies. She should have kept copies. She filed that away in the specific category of things she was going to have to sit with later when there was time to sit with things, and moved on. At 12:40 in the afternoon, Okafor received a call that changed the shape of the next several hours. The Renfield Medical Systems records, being imaged in Helena, contained a contract modification document dated 16 months ago, 2 months before the first documented record falsification at Harlow Valley. The modification had been executed between Renfield's regional director and a hospital board member whose name did not appear in any of the investigative materials generated to date. A board member, not Stahl, above Stahl. Okafor took the call in the hallway. Nora watched his face through the window of the waiting room and read the shift in it. Not the shift of bad news, but the shift of a picture becoming larger than the frame you'd built for it. He came back in and sat down. "The board member," he said. "His name is Gerald Fitch. He's been on the Harlow Valley board for 9 years. He's also a limited partner in a medical real estate investment group that holds the building lease for 2 of the other hospitals in the procurement network. He had financial interest in the hospitals staying off any liability record," Nora said. "Multiple hospitals, across 3 states. Okafor put the tablet down. Stahl was implementing a policy that Fitch had structural motivation to maintain. The record falsification wasn't just protecting one hospital from liability. It was protecting a network of facilities from the kind of regulatory scrutiny that would have affected Fitch's real estate investments. Nora sat with that for a moment. "Fitch is on the board," she said. "The board conducts the formal employee review process." "Yes." "My suspension goes to the board for formal review." "Yes." "Which means Gerald Fitch, whose financial interests are directly connected to the cover-up I've been suspended for attempting to expose, has a formal role in adjudicating my termination." Okafor looked at her. "That conflict of interest is now part of the federal record." "But the board meeting is scheduled," she said. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "Yes." She thought about that. Tomorrow morning, a board that included a man who had co-engineered 14 months of patient safety fraud was scheduled to formally review and terminate a nurse who had performed a correct life-saving procedure and been suspended for it. The termination would go on her record. The record would follow her. That was how it had worked for all 18 employees in Collins' folder. Clean until they weren't. The file built before anyone knew to look at it. "Fitch will be at that meeting," she said. "Fitch doesn't know yet that his name is in the Renfield records," Okafor said carefully. "The Helena team is maintaining operational security until we have the full chain documented." Nora looked at him. "You're going to let the board meeting happen," she said. Okafor was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to let the board meeting begin," he said. "There's a difference." She understood what he was not saying. She understood it the way she understood clinical situations where the intervention point was not the moment of crisis, but the moment just after, when the crisis had declared itself fully, and the response could be total and unambiguous and visible to everyone present. "I need to be in that room," she said. "You'll be in that room," Okafor said. "You're the subject of the review. I need you to be in that room." "I'll be in that room." He looked at her steadily. "And I need you to understand that when I come through that door, what happens next is a federal proceeding, and it goes the way federal proceedings go, which is slowly and procedurally and not in the way it looks in the version of this you have in your head." "I know," she said. She did know. She also knew that slowly and procedurally and publicly was exactly right, because the 18 employees in Collins' folder had been removed quietly, individually, in processes that nobody witnessed, and what they deserved, what the 11 families deserved, was the opposite of quiet. Her phone buzzed. The burner. Sutter. She looked at the message. Fitch just called Stahl. Stahl's phone is on a tap. Fitch told Stahl the board meeting goes forward as planned and Callahan's termination is finalized in the morning. He said, "We need the record clean before this gets any noisier." Then a second message. "He doesn't know we have the Helena records. He thinks he's still ahead of it." Nora put the phone in her pocket. She looked at the door of the waiting room. Through the window, the hallway of the 3rd floor of Harlow Valley Medical Center was ordinary. Nurses moving between rooms, the sound of monitors, the institutional quiet of a place doing the ongoing work of keeping people alive. Tomorrow morning, a man who had helped orchestrate the deaths of 11 patients was going to sit at a board table and vote to finalize the termination of the nurse who had exposed it. I was going to walk into that room thinking he was still in control of what happened next. He was wrong. And he wouldn't know he was wrong until Okafor walked through the door, and by then every person at that table would be watching. The night before the board meeting, Nora didn't sleep. She didn't fight it. She'd learned a long time ago that fighting sleeplessness was a way of making it worse, and that the body's refusal to go quiet before something significant was not weakness, but information. The nervous system running its pre-operational checks, cataloging what it knew, identifying what it didn't. She'd spent nights like this before, in places where the morning brought things that couldn't be undone, and the ritual of lying in a dark room pretending to rest had always felt like a performance for nobody. She sat at the small table in the room Okafor's team had arranged at Fort Dillon. Functional, spare, a government-issue space that smelled like industrial cleaning products and recycled air. And she went through the documentation one more time, not because she needed to, because she needed to know she'd gone through it one more time. Colin slept in the next room. She could hear him through the thin wall, the specific uneven rhythm of someone sleeping hard after too many hours of adrenaline, and she was glad for it. He was 28 years old and he had spent 11 months inside a building that was quietly destroying the evidence of its own harm, building a case with the methodical patience of someone who understood that the documentation had to be bulletproof because he was going to be the first person they tried to discredit when it surfaced. He'd done it right. The cost of doing it right had been real, and she wasn't going to diminish that, but he'd done it right. She thought about Dana Price, who had done it right from the outside for 8 months with no institutional support and no backup, and the particular courage of someone who has already lost the thing they stood to lose and has decided that losing it was not going to be the end of what they did about it. She thought about the 18 employees in the folder. Some of them she'd never know by name. Some of them had moved on to other jobs in other towns and were living their lives without knowing that the documentation of what they'd seen had survived and was now sitting in an authenticated federal archive. She thought about what it would mean to those people to find out. Not today, not in a clean single moment, but eventually, through the slow procedural channels that Okafor had described, to find out that the file that had been built against them was built on falsified ground. She thought about the 11 families. That was the one she kept coming back to. Not because the others were less, but because the 11 were the weight at the center of all of it. The thing that made every other element of this not an institutional scandal, but something that lived in the body, in the specific way grief about something that didn't have to happen always lived in the body. At 4 in the morning, she made a cup of the bad coffee available in the hallway and took it back to the table and sat with it and looked at the wall and thought about something that was not the case, or the board meeting, or the documentation. She thought about who she'd been before Creston Falls. Not nostalgically, just clearly, the way you look at a photograph of an earlier version of yourself and try to read what the person in it was carrying. She had been a combat medic for 7 years. She had been good at it. Not in the way that people said you were good at things, to make you feel acknowledged, but in the empirical way, the way the outcomes reflected, the way the people she worked with trusted her hands in situations where trust was extended based on demonstrated evidence rather than personal feeling. She had saved people in places where saving them required her to make decisions in the space between no time and no information and no margin. Then she had come home to a country that did not have a formal category for what she had been, or what she had seen, or what she knew how to do, and she had put it all in a room with the door mostly closed and become a civilian ER nurse in a small Montana town and tried to find out what it was like to live in a place where the stakes felt manageable. The stakes had not stayed manageable. She was not sure, sitting at that table at 4 in the morning, whether she was glad about that or not. Both felt true simultaneously. She was tired in a way that sleep wouldn't fix, and she was more fully herself than she'd been in 4 years. And those two things existed in the same body at the same time, and she didn't try to resolve the contradiction because it wasn't a contradiction that could be resolved. It was just what it was. She drank the bad coffee. She waited for morning. The Harlow Valley Medical Center boardroom was on the 4th floor, a room that had been designed to communicate institutional authority, with a long mahogany table and upholstered chairs and framed photographs of the hospital at various stages of its history, arranged on the wall behind the board chair's position. Gerald Fitch sat in that chair. He was 63, white-haired, with the settled physical confidence of a man who had been the most powerful person in every room he'd entered for so long that it had become structural rather than performed. 7 other board members sat along the table. Warren Stahl was present, to Fitch's right, with a legal pad in front of him that he was not writing on. Dr. Curtis Bragg sat at the far end as a clinical representative. Phil from HR was near the door with a stack of folders. Nora sat on the other side of the table, alone, with a single notepad and the visitor credential she hadn't yet surrendered. The room smelled like the coffee that had been set up on a credenza and that nobody had touched. Fitch opened the meeting at 8:02 with the practiced efficiency of someone who ran meetings the way they ran everything, with the assumption that the outcome was already determined and the meeting was the formality required to make it official. Ms. Callahan, he said, the purpose of this review is to formally address the events of 2 days ago and the existing performance concerns in your file. You've been provided with the documentation. He looked at her over reading glasses. Do you have anything to add before the board deliberates? Nora looked at him. She thought about what to say, and then she thought about the fact that what she said in the next 30 seconds was less important than what was about to walk through the door, and she said the thing that was simply and precisely true. Everything I've done in that building, she said, I documented. Everything I found, I can support with evidence. And every patient I intervened on is alive. She paused. I don't have anything to add. I think the board should proceed. Fitch nodded with the satisfaction of someone who has just received the answer they expected and can now move efficiently toward the conclusion they'd already written. He looked at Stahl. Warren, if you'd like to present the formal. The door opened. Okafor came in first with his DOJ credentials already extended in his right hand, and behind him 2 agents, and behind them a woman Nora hadn't met but recognized by her bearing as the kind of federal attorney who entered rooms the way weather systems entered rooms. Not loudly, but with the unmistakable pressure of something that was going to change the conditions in the space, regardless of what was already happening there. Gerald Fitch, Okafor said. Not a question. Darren Okafor, Department of Justice, Office of the Inspector General. I have a federal notification to deliver to this board before this meeting proceeds any further. Fitch did not stand up. He looked at Okafor with the particular stillness of a man who is prepared, in some part of himself, for a version of this moment, and whose preparation has just met the actual version, and found that the actual version was larger than the prepared one. This is a private administrative meeting, Fitch said. It was, Okafor said. He set a document on the table in front of Fitch. As of this morning, Gerald Fitch, you are the subject of a federal investigation into procurement fraud, conspiracy to falsify federally connected medical records, and potential liability in connection with patient mortality events at Harlow Valley Medical Center and 2 additional facilities in which you hold financial interest. He looked around the table. This board meeting is now part of the federal record. Every person in this room should contact independent legal counsel before participating in any further deliberation. The silence in the boardroom had a specific texture. Nora had been in rooms where silence had different qualities. The silence after a code that didn't go right. The silence in a casualty collection point between one wave of wounded and the next. And this silence had the quality of a structure recognizing its own instability. The board members around the table were looking at each other, and at Fitch, and at the document in front of Fitch. And the ones who were going to survive this were already doing the calculation, and you could see it moving behind their faces. Stahl was looking at the legal pad in front of him. He had picked up his pen and set it down. Bragg had gone very still at the far end of the table. Phil from HR stood up and left the room. Nobody stopped him. His departure was not an act of defiance. It was the departure of someone who had decided that whatever came next, he was going to be on the correct side of it, and the correct side was outside that room with a phone to his attorney's number. Fitch looked at the document. Then he looked at Okafor. I'd like to call my attorney, he said. You're welcome to do that, Okafor said. The document in front of you details what the investigation has established. I'd encourage you to read it before you make that call. Fitch looked at the document. Nora watched him read it. She watched the particular process of a man who has constructed a version of his situation and is having it replaced, line by line, with a different version, and she did not feel what she might have expected to feel. Not satisfaction exactly, not the clean release of something concluded. What she felt was something quieter and more complicated. The feeling of a thing that should not have been allowed to go on for as long as it did finally being stopped, and the gap between those 2 things being the part that wouldn't resolve quickly. Okafor looked at her across the table. She gave him a small nod. What followed was not a single dramatic moment, but a sequence of processes, which was how justice actually worked when it worked. Not as a scene, but as a structure, assembled piece by piece, each piece requiring the one before it. Warren Stahl was formally interviewed by federal agents later that morning. His attorney arrived at 11 and advised him to cooperate, which was the advice given by attorneys who understood the weight of the evidence and the benefit of early cooperation over the marginal gains of resistance. By afternoon, Stahl had provided a formal statement that confirmed the record falsification program, identified Fitch as the originating authority, and named the Renfield Medical Systems contact who had provided the vendor-side access. That contact, a regional director named Paul Merritt, the unremarkable man from Collins' workspace and from the step-down room at the patient's bedside, was taken into federal custody in Helena by 2 in the afternoon. He had been attempting to leave the state, which Okafor's team had anticipated and positioned for. Curtis Bragg submitted a statement through his attorney that was technically cooperative and substantively minimal. The statement of someone trying to establish the smallest possible personal involvement in events he had nonetheless been aware of. The Montana Board of Medical Examiners opened a formal review of his license that afternoon, based on the documentation of his conduct in the trauma bay and his participation in the post-event administrative action against Nora. That review was going to take time, but it was open. The Renfield Medical Systems Regional Office in Helena was sealed. The federal procurement fraud investigation, which had been running in parallel for 4 months and had been waiting for the clinical documentation that Colin and Dana Price had assembled, moved from preliminary to active federal case. The scope of it: 3 states, 8 hospital sites, federal procurement funds, falsified equipment records, patient mortality implications, was the kind of case that generated coverage at the federal level, the kind that reached the offices of people who were responsible for the program and who had their own motivations to cooperate quickly and completely once the full structure was visible. Gerald Fitch was escorted from Harlow Valley Medical Center at noon by 2 federal agents. He walked through the main lobby. It was not staged. The timing was procedural, not theatrical. But the hospital staff who were in the lobby at that moment saw it. And the staff who weren't in the lobby heard about it within the hour, because hospitals were closed ecosystems where information moved at the speed of the break room, and what moved through Harlow Valley Medical Center that afternoon was the specific information that the thing people had been sensing for months and not been able to name had been real, and it was over, and the people responsible for it were being held accountable in the only way that actually counted. Nora was not in the lobby when Fitch walked through it. She was on the 2nd floor, in the step-down unit, standing in the doorway of room 214. The patient was sitting up. His color was right. His pressure had held through the night, and his repeat cardiac ultrasound had shown the effusion resolving without further intervention. Dr. Morant had been in at 7 and had used the word remarkable in the context of his recovery trajectory, and the patient had looked at Nora when Morant said it with an expression that communicated, without words, that he found remarkable a somewhat modest descriptor for what had actually happened. Nora leaned against the doorframe. "They picked up Merritt in Helena," she said. He nodded slowly. "I figured. Do you want to know the rest?" "Not today." He looked at the window. The October sky over Creston Falls was flat gray with the specific density of a system moving in from the northwest, the kind of weather that settled into a Montana valley and stayed for days. "Today I just want to know that it's moving." "It's moving," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Donna. She's safe. She's given her statement. The physical documentation she retained is authenticated and in the federal record." Nora paused. "She wants to talk to you when you're out of here." "I know." He turned from the window. "And your brother?" "He'll be fine." She said it with the particular firmness of someone who is deciding it in addition to believing it. "He did everything right. The documentation he built is the center of the case." The patient looked at her for a long moment. "You did everything right too," he said. "You know that." "I missed some things," she said. "Yeah." He didn't argue with it. "So did I." He looked at his hands. "That's different from doing it wrong." She thought about that. She wasn't sure she'd fully resolved the difference yet. Maybe the difference was something you kept working out over time, rather than something you arrived at once and kept. "When you're cleared for discharge," she said, "Sutter is going to want a debrief." "I know, and there's going to be a federal testimony process." "I know that too." He looked at her. "What are you going to do?" She hadn't answered that question for herself yet in any complete way. She'd been moving through the last 48 hours with the focused operational momentum of situations that required it, and the question of what she was going to do when the situation resolved was one she'd been deferring with the practiced efficiency of someone who knew that deferring it was necessary and also that it was going to stop being deferrable soon. "I don't know yet," she said. It was the honest answer. He nodded. That was enough. "Bet." The formal notification of Nora's reinstatement came through Harlow Valley's acting administrative director, a board member named Ruth Calloway, no relation, who had been appointed to manage hospital operations pending the investigation's resolution at 4:15 that afternoon. It was a single-page letter on hospital letterhead that stated, in the careful language of institutional documents trying to cover a large distance in a short space, that the suspension and pending termination had been reviewed in light of new information and were rescinded, that her clinical conduct had been found to be within appropriate standards, and that she was welcome to return to her position in the emergency department. Petra handed her the letter in the ER charge office. She'd been the one to receive it on Nora's behalf. Nora read it. She read it a second time. Then she set it on the desk. They used the phrase appropriate standards, she said. I noticed that, Petra said. The standard was that I saved a man's life and correctly identified a tension pneumothorax in a patient who would have arrested before the imaging came back. That's not appropriate. That's correct. I know. I'm going to need the letter to say that. Petra looked at her for a moment. You're going to make the acting director rewrite the reinstatement letter. I'm going to ask her to accurately characterize what happened, Nora said. She can decide how to do that. Petra's expression did something complex. Then she picked up the phone on her desk. The letter was rewritten. It took 2 hours and 3 drafts, and the final version used the phrase clinically correct and life-saving interventions and formally acknowledged that the original suspension had been issued in error. It was added to Nora's personnel file. The previous suspension notice and the fabricated pattern documentation that had been constructed in the weeks before it were removed from her file and placed into the federal evidentiary record, where they would serve as documentation of the administrative misconduct rather than documentation of Nora's. She signed the reinstatement acknowledgement at 6:40 in the evening. Then she went to find the acting director and had a different conversation. Ruth Calloway was in her 60s, a board member who had spent 9 years in a governance role without knowing the full extent of what the administration below her had been doing, and the weight of that was visible on her face in the way that the weight of things you could not have prevented but still felt responsible for was always visible. She received Nora in the 4th floor conference room, not the boardroom, a smaller one, with the quiet attention of someone who understood that she was in a conversation where listening was more important than managing. Nora told her what the ER needed, not what she personally needed, what the department needed, specifically a patient safety reporting structure that did not route through administrative channels that could be controlled by anyone with motivation to suppress the reports. A direct pathway, documented and auditable, from clinical staff to an independent oversight body that existed outside the hospital's own governance. It doesn't have to be complicated, Nora said. It has to be independent and it has to be real. Not a form that goes into a database that administration controls. A process where the person filing the report knows it was received by someone without a stake in suppressing it. Calloway looked at her. That would require a structural change to how we handle internal compliance. Yes, Nora said, it would. Who would you propose to oversee it? Nora had thought about this. She'd been thinking about it since the 3 in the morning version of herself had been sitting with bad coffee and a wall and the weight of 18 employees in a folder. A joint committee, clinical staff representatives, an external patient safety advocate, and a liaison to the state health department. No administrative voting members on the reporting intake side. Calloway was quiet for a moment. If I propose this to the reconstituted board, she said, I'll need someone willing to lead the clinical staff side of it. Nora had expected this question and had not yet fully answered it to herself, which meant the answer she gave was the one her gut produced before her more cautious systems could moderate it. I'll do it, she said, alongside my ER position, not instead of it. I'm not leaving the floor. Calloway nodded slowly. That's not a small thing you're taking on. No, Nora agreed. It isn't. She said it without complaint. Work that mattered was not supposed to be small. She'd spent years doing work that was not small in places where the scale of it was measured in outcomes she couldn't always affect, and she'd come to Creston Falls looking for something that felt manageable and instead found something that needed to be done and that she was positioned to do. That was not what she'd planned. It was also, she was beginning to understand, what she'd been built for, not despite the years that preceded it, but because of them. Colin drove to Fort Dillon to collect the rest of his things on a Saturday. He was going back to Creston Falls. Not to the hospital. He'd decided that, and Nora hadn't tried to change it. He'd been offered a position with a federal contractor working on medical equipment compliance auditing, a job that would use everything he'd spent 11 months learning and wouldn't require him to spend another year undercover in a building where people he'd reported to had known, on some level, that he was looking. He came to the hospital first. He stood in the ER lobby with his jacket zipped and his hands in his pockets and looked at the building from the inside with the expression of someone completing a loop. Nora found him there on her break. "How do you feel?" she asked. He thought about it. "Weird," he said. "Like I finished something, but I don't know yet what finished means." "Yeah," she said. "That's about right." They stood there for a moment in the lobby. The ER was running. The board showed 3 patients, nothing critical at this exact moment, the particular held breath quality of a department between events. "Dana called me," he said. "She's going back to Billings. She has a job offer, medical consulting, equipment compliance." He paused. "She said to tell you that she read about what you did in that step-down room, and she wants to buy you a drink when this is all finished." "When it's all finished is going to be a while," Nora said. "She said she figured that." Colin looked at her. He had the look of someone who had something to say and was deciding whether to say it, which was a look she recognized from their entire lives. "Say it," she said. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you what I was doing," he said. "From the beginning. I know why I didn't, but I'm still sorry." She looked at her brother, 28 years old, thin from the stress of the last year, with their father's eyes and a patience that was entirely his own. And she thought about what to say, and the thing she thought of was not a reassurance or an absolution, but the thing that was actually true. "You did something I didn't do," she said. "I was in this building for 4 years, and I filed 3 reports, and I watched them go nowhere, and I didn't pull on the thread." She paused. "You pulled on the thread. You saved the person who was going to carry it out," he said. "Twice," she said. He almost smiled. "Twice," he agreed. They stood there a little longer. Then his phone rang, and it was someone from the federal contractor position, and he stepped away to take it, and Nora went back to the ER, and the loop closed in the quiet, ordinary way that loops closed when the dramatic part was done and the actual work was continuing. 3 weeks later, Sutter brought Atlas to the hospital. No advance notice, no arrangement. He pulled into the ambulance bay on a Thursday afternoon and sent a text that said only outside. And when Nora came through the bay doors in her scrubs with her badge clipped to her chest pocket, her badge reinstated with the clean record beneath it, Atlas was sitting at the bottom of the ramp in the same position he'd sat in on the night she'd been walked out. Like the intervening weeks had been a parenthesis, and this was the continuation of the same sentence. He stood when he saw her. Nora came down the ramp. She crouched and put both hands on either side of his face and looked at him, the way she hadn't permitted herself to look at him in the parking lot that night, because the parking lot that night had not been a moment for that. Sutter stood to the side. He wasn't watching the dog. He was watching the parking lot in the way he watched things, systematically, without making a performance of it. "He's being retired next month," Sutter said. "HIP's going to make continued deployment impractical." "Where does he go?" "Handler, usually, or a qualified civilian." He looked at her. "Reyes already has a dog at home." Nora looked at Atlas, the hip that she'd noted at Brennan's tap, the left rear compensation, the slight drop on the settle. She thought about the 24-hour veterinary clinic on Route 9. She thought about an apartment that had always been too quiet and had always felt like a temporary arrangement. "He'd need a vet familiar with working dog orthopedics," she said. "Dr. Paulson on Route 9, Sutter said. "I remember." She looked at him. I was looking at the parking lot. "Jake," she said. He turned. "Thank you," she said. "Not for the dog specifically. For all of it. The parking lot and the drive and the text that said they know about your brother and the 48 hours of operational support that hadn't appeared on any official record." He nodded once. The particular nod of someone who doesn't need the acknowledgement but receives it without dismissing it. "The patient's been discharged," he said, 2 days ago. "He's going to testify when the federal case goes to the next stage." He paused. "He asked me to give you something." He held out a folded piece of paper. She opened it. It was a military service record. Her own. Not the civilian version, not the redacted summary. The full operational record, with the classifications removed. covering 7 years and 3 deployments, and every citation and field commendation and line of documentation that described what she had actually done and where she had actually been and who she had actually been when she was doing it. At the bottom, in handwriting she recognized, a single line. You never needed anyone to see this, but you should have it. Nora folded the paper and put it in her pocket. Atlas pressed his head against her hip. She put her hand on the back of his neck and stood there in the ambulance bay with the October air coming down off the pine ridge and the ER behind her running with the continuous low-grade urgency of a place that never fully stopped. And she understood something that she hadn't understood at 4 a.m. 3 weeks ago, or at least hadn't understood it in the complete way she understood it now. The years in the field hadn't been a separate life that she'd tried to leave behind. They were the architecture, everything she'd built on top of them, the nursing degree, the 4 years in the ER, the incident reports that went nowhere, the quiet competence that nobody had asked about and nobody had recorded. That was the same structure expressed in a different register. The discipline was the same. The attention was the same. The refusal to look away from what was actually happening, even when looking at it was professionally inconvenient, was the same. She was not two people. She had never been two people. She had just been waiting, in a small Montana town, for the moment when both halves of what she was would be required simultaneously. And when that moment had come, she hadn't been ready for it in the ways she'd imagined readiness, but she'd been ready in the ways that mattered, which was that she'd shown up, and she'd done the work, and she'd let what she knew count for something even when the people with authority to discount it had tried very hard to do exactly that. That was the thing, she thought. That was the thing nobody told you when they dismissed you. The knowledge didn't go anywhere when they looked away from it. It just waited. Her pager sounded. She looked at it. Bay 2. Incoming. She didn't know yet what she was going to find in Bay 2. She didn't need to know. She had the training and the hands and 4 years of context in that building, and she had a reinstated badge in a department that needed her, and she had a piece of paper in her pocket that confirmed what she already knew and a dog that would be waiting for her when her shift was done. She looked at Sutter. I have to go, she said. Go, he said. She went. Atlas watched her push through the ambulance bay doors, and then he sat down in the afternoon light at the bottom of the ramp, ears forward, with the settled certainty of an animal that has found where it belongs and is not in any hurry to leave. The doors swung shut behind her. The ER was already moving. She moved with it.